By the end of the night, not a single person in that opulent, suffocating room would dare to even whisper her last name. They would remember it only in the cold silence of their ruin, a name that had become a verdict. But at the beginning of the night, when she first walked in wearing a simple black dress that cost less than the wine being served as a palate cleanser, they had laughed at it. They had laughed at her. Ilara felt their eyes on her the moment she stepped through the grand, carved doors of the Sterling mansion. It was less an appraisal and more a dissection. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and old money, seemed to catch in her throat. Julian squeezed her hand, his smile a perfect polished thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a smile she was beginning to realize was a piece of armor, not an invitation. "Relax," he murmured, his voice a low thrum of practiced reassurance. "They're going to love you." She knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that this was a lie. She could feel the collective judgment of the Sterling family coalescing into a single, palpable force. It was in the way Julian's father, Arthur Sterling, gave her a handshake that was more of a dismissal, his eyes flicking over her dress with an almost imperceptible curl of his lip. It was in the way the scattered cousins and aunts offered brittle smiles that were as fragile and empty as spun sugar. But most of all, it was in the gaze of Beatrice Sterling, Julian's mother. Beatrice stood by the massive marble fireplace, a queen in her own domain, draped in emerald silk that shimmered like dragon scales. Her eyes, the same cool gray as her son's, swept over Ilara from head to toe, and in that single, silent pass, Ilara felt every one of her insecurities flare to life. She felt underdressed, undereducated, and entirely out of place. The dress had been a point of contention. Julian had offered to buy her something new, something appropriate. He had gestured vaguely towards a boutique where the price tags had more zeros than her bank account. She had refused, gently but firmly. The black dress was simple, elegant, and hers. It was a dress she had bought with her own money, to celebrate a small victory at work months ago. Wearing it felt like holding onto a piece of herself in a house that seemed determined to swallow her whole. Now, under Beatrice's glacial stare, she wondered if it had been a foolish stand to take. "Julian, darling," Beatrice said, her voice a silken blade. She glided towards them, ignoring Ilara completely for a long moment. She kissed her son's cheek, a proprietary gesture. "You're late." "Traffic was a nightmare, Mother," Julian said, his easy charm deflecting the criticism. "You know how it is? You remember Ilara, of course?" Beatrice finally turned her attention to Ilara. It felt like being examined under a microscope. "Of course," she said, the words clipped. "How could I forget?" The implication hung in the air, that Ilara was unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Dinner was an exquisitely orchestrated torture. The conversation flowed around Ilara, a torrent of names she didn't know, places she hadn't been, and brands she couldn't afford. The Sterlings spoke a coded language of wealth and status, and she was illiterate. She tried to follow along, nodding and smiling, but her contributions felt clumsy and small. When Arthur asked her what she did, she explained her job as a junior archivist at the city library, a job she loved for its quiet order and the stories hidden in the stacks. "An archivist," Arthur repeated, the word sounding foreign and slightly absurd in his mouth. He shared a look with his wife. "How quaint." The condescension was a physical thing, a pressure building in her chest. She looked to Julian for support, for a lifeline, but he was deep in conversation with his father about stock portfolios and a hostile takeover they were planning. He was in his element, his face animated, his gestures broad and confident. He was a Sterling, through and through. The man who held her hand in her small apartment and told her she was everything he ever wanted seemed like a distant memory, a character in a play she had misread. She felt a prickle of unease, a familiar shadow of a doubt she had been pushing away for months. She loved Julian, or at least, she loved the man he was when they were alone, the tender, funny, attentive man who seemed to see her, truly see her. But this version of him, the Sterling heir, was a stranger. A cold, polished stranger who fit seamlessly into this world that was rejecting her so thoroughly. The main course was cleared away by silent, uniformed staff. The crystal glasses were refilled with a dessert wine that shimmered gold under the chandelier. Ilara felt a sense of dread curdle in her stomach. This was the moment. She knew, instinctively, that the performance was over and the real purpose of this dinner was about to be revealed. Beatrice dabbed her lips with a linen napkin, a gesture of finality. She placed the napkin on the table and folded her hands, her rings catching the light. The faint chatter around the table died down as if on cue. All eyes turned to her. "Ilara," Beatrice began, her voice losing its feigned warmth and taking on a hard, metallic edge. "We've allowed you and Julian your little romance. It's been diverting. But now, things are becoming serious. Julian has informed us of his intentions." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced at Julian, but he refused to meet her gaze. He was staring at his wineglass, a muscle twitching in his jaw. There was no support there, no defense, only a tense, waiting silence. "A marriage into the Sterling family is not merely a personal matter," Beatrice continued, her voice resonating with an authority that was absolute in this house. "It is a merger, a business transaction, and as with any transaction, we must protect our assets." From beside her, Arthur produced a slim leather portfolio and slid it across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of Ilara's plate. The portfolio was a deep blood red. It felt like a threat. "This is a prenuptial agreement," Arthur said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Our lawyers have drafted it. It's quite standard, I assure you. It simply clarifies that what is ours remains ours." Beatrice's lips curved into a smile that was all teeth. "You come to this family with nothing, Ilara. The agreement ensures you will leave with nothing. It's the only sensible way to proceed." Her eyes glinted with a cruel, triumphant light. "We can't have any messy misunderstandings down the line." The humiliation was breathtaking. It was a physical blow, sucking the air from her lungs. They hadn't just judged her. They had convicted her. In their eyes, she was a predator, a gold digger, a threat to be neutralized with legal documents. And they had done it here, in front of the entire family, turning her proposal into a public shaming. Her hands were trembling. She stared at the red portfolio, unable to touch it. It seemed to pulse with the family's collective disdain. She could feel the eyes of Julian's cousins on her, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They were waiting to see what the charity case would do. She started, her voice a reedy whisper. She cleared her throat, trying to find her voice. "I don't understand. Julian, we talked about this. We talked about a future. And this is part of it," Julian said, finally looking at her. But his eyes were cold, distant. He was his mother's son. "It's just a piece of paper, Ilara. Don't be so dramatic. If you love me, you'll sign it." The emotional blackmail was so blatant, so cruel, that it almost made her laugh. If you love me. He was using her own feelings as a weapon against her. He was siding with them, with their cold, calculated assessment of her worth. And her worth, in their eyes, was 0. You bring nothing to this table, Beatrice repeated, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that carried across the silent room. So you will sign a document that ensures you take nothing from it. It is only fair. That was the phrase, the one that would echo in Ilara's mind for weeks to come, the one that would burn away the last vestiges of her naive love and leave behind something hard and unyielding. You bring nothing to this table. She felt a strange calm settle over her. The hurt was still there, a raw, gaping wound in her chest, but it was being rapidly overlaid by a layer of icy clarity. She was seeing them for what they were. Not just wealthy and arrogant, but predatory and deeply insecure. Their power was built on a foundation of exclusion and contempt for anyone they deemed lesser. She looked around the table, at the smug, expectant faces. They thought they had her trapped. They thought her only options were humiliation or destitution. They had laid out their terms, confident in her weakness, in her love for Julian, in her perceived desperation. A tiny, almost imperceptible detail caught her attention. A small detail she had overlooked in her initial shock. Beatrice, in her grand pronouncements, had yet to use Ilara's full name. She had been Ilara, her, the girl. It was another subtle way of diminishing her. My family name? Ilara said, her voice surprisingly steady. You haven't asked about it. Beatrice waved a dismissive hand. Family names only matter when they come with a portfolio, dear. What is it? Smith? Jones? The cousins tittered. It's Vance, Ilara said quietly. Ilara Vance. A flicker of something crossed Beatrice's face. Not recognition, not yet. More like a faint, nagging familiarity, like a word on the tip of her tongue. Vance, she repeated, tasting the name. Vance. There was a Vance who used to be on the board of the country club. A dreadful man, always complaining about the dues. Arthur Sterling, however, had gone still. He was looking at Ilara with a new, sharp intensity. The quaint little archivist was suddenly an object of scrutiny. Vance? He asked, his voice tight. Any relation to Harold Vance? The question was a shot in the dark, a dismissive query meant to highlight the absurdity of the connection. Harold Vance was a legend, a reclusive genius who had built a tech empire, Vance Innovations, from the ground up. He was a titan of industry, a man the Sterlings, for all their inherited wealth, could only ever aspire to be. The idea that this girl in her cheap dress could be connected to him was ludicrous. Ilara met his gaze. The calm within her was spreading, a cold fire. They had no idea. They had no idea who she was, what she was. They saw a meek little librarian, and their arrogance, their blinding, monumental arrogance, had prevented them from looking any deeper. Harold was my grandfather, she said, her voice clear and simple and utterly devastating in its truth. A profound silence fell over the dining room. It was heavier and more absolute than the expectant silence from before. The tittering cousins stopped. The smirks vanished. Julian, who had been looking bored and impatient, snapped his head up, his face a mask of disbelief. Beatrice let out a short, sharp laugh, but it was brittle, fragile. Don't be ridiculous. That's impossible. Harold Vance never married. He had no children. Everyone knows that. He never married, Ilara agreed, her voice still quiet, but now it held a note of steel. But he had a daughter he was estranged from for many years. My mother. He reconciled with her before she passed away. And after she was gone, he found me. She didn't need to elaborate. She didn't need to tell them the whole story. Not yet. She didn't need to describe the lonely years after her mother's death, the struggle, the quiet determination to make her own way. She didn't need to describe the letter that had arrived one day, written in a shaky but determined hand, from a grandfather she never knew she had. She didn't need to tell them about the weekends spent in a quiet, book-filled mansion. Not a place of opulence, but of intellect and quiet affection. A place where a brilliant, lonely old man had found a connection in his final years. A place where he had taught her everything he knew, not just about business and finance, but about character, integrity, and the true measure of a person's worth. She didn't need to tell them that Harold Vance, a man with no other heirs, had left everything to the granddaughter who had cared for him, who had read to him, who had listened to his stories, and who had loved him not for his billions, but for the quiet kindness in his eyes. She just let the silence stretch, letting the implications sink in. Arthur Sterling's face had gone pale, a waxy, unhealthy color. The hostile takeover he and Julian had been so gleefully discussing earlier. She knew from the papers Julian had carelessly left on his desk that the target company was a smaller tech firm. A firm whose most valuable asset was a portfolio of patents licensed from a larger, more powerful entity, an entity called Vance Innovations. Beatrice was still sputtering, her carefully constructed composure cracking. "I don't believe you. You're a liar. This is some kind of pathetic trick." Ilara slowly reached into her simple, inexpensive handbag. The one they had probably assumed held nothing more than a used lipstick and a bus pass. Her fingers closed around a small, worn, leather-bound journal. It was not a legal document. It was not a stock certificate. It was something far more powerful. She placed it on the table next to the blood-red portfolio. The journal was old, its cover softened with age. On the front, embossed in faded gold leaf, were two initials, H.V. "My grandfather gave me this," she said. "It's his personal journal. He wrote in it every day for 50 years. He wrote about his company, his regrets, his hopes. He wrote about my mother. And in the last few years, he wrote about me." She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The object itself was enough. It was a tangible link to a man whose legacy they were trying to co-opt, whose power they coveted. "He also wrote about Sterling Corp," she added, her gaze locking with Arthur's. "He wrote about your father and his father before him. He had a long memory." The threat was veiled, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Arthur Sterling flinched as if she had struck him. The history between the Vances and the Sterlings was not one of friendly rivalry. It was a history of betrayals, stolen ideas, and bitter lawsuits that the Sterlings had only won through attrition and backroom deals. Harold Vance had lost those battles, but he had apparently not forgotten them, and he had documented everything. Julian finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate sound. "Ilara, what is this? What are you doing?" She turned to him, and for the first time, he saw not the gentle, loving woman he had taken for granted, but a stranger. Her eyes were clear, cold, and full of a power he had never suspected. "I'm showing you what I bring to the table," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. She stood up, her movements graceful and deliberate. She left the journal on the table, a silent testament to the truth she had just unleashed. She didn't look at the prenuptial agreement. It was an irrelevant artifact from a reality that no longer existed. She walked out of the dining room, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply left. The sound of her simple, inexpensive shoes on the marble floor was the only sound in the vast, silent mansion. It was the sound of a world shifting on its axis. The sound of a queen leaving the jesters to their crumbling court. The real work, she knew, had just begun. The drive home was a blur. Elara didn't remember the precise route she took, only the feeling of the steering wheel, cool and solid beneath her trembling hands. The city lights smeared past her window, a watercolor of reds and golds that failed to penetrate the icy bubble of shock that enveloped her. The scene at the dinner table replayed in her mind on a relentless loop. Beatrice's sneer, Arthur's dismissive wave, Julian's cold, vacant eyes, and the words, those damnable words. "You bring nothing to this table." She had brought them the truth. She had brought them the one thing that could shatter their carefully polished world, and in their arrogance, they had handed her the very weapon she needed to do it. The motivation, the pure, unadulterated rage that was now beginning to smolder beneath the surface of her grief. When she got back to her small, cozy apartment, the apartment Julian had always called charming, with a faint, almost imperceptible note of condescension, she didn't turn on the lights. She stood in the darkness, the familiar shapes of her furniture offering a strange, hollow comfort. This was her space, her life. A life she had been so willing, so eager to merge with his. How had she been so blind? The answer was simple and humiliating in its own right. She had been in love. Or she had been in love with a carefully constructed fiction. A man who bought her flowers and remembered the names of her favorite authors. A man who listened to her dreams and made her feel seen. But that man didn't exist. He was a facade, a role Julian played when it suited him. The real Julian was the man in that dining room, the one who watched, silent and complicit, as his family tore her apart. A deep, shuddering sob escaped her, the first she had allowed since leaving the Sterling mansion. It was a raw, painful sound that seemed to be pulled from the depths of her soul. She sank onto her sofa, curling into a tight ball, and let the grief wash over her. It was a tidal wave of betrayal, of heartbreak, of a future that had been stolen from her before it had even begun. She mourned the man she thought Julian was. She mourned the love she thought they shared. She mourned the simple, happy future she had envisioned, a life of shared laughter, quiet evenings, and mutual respect. A life that had just been revealed as a complete and utter fantasy. The grief was a physical thing, a heavy weight in her chest. But as the hours ticked by and the first pale light of dawn began to creep through her window, something else began to stir within her. Anger. It started as a low, slow burn, a spark of indignation that the grief could not extinguish. They had called her nothing. They had valued her at zero. They had looked at her life's work, her kindness, her love, and deemed it worthless. They had done it with such casual cruelty, such unthinking arrogance. The sheer injustice of it was a whetstone, sharpening her anger into a fine, sharp point. She thought of her grandfather, Harold. She remembered the long afternoons in his study, surrounded by books and the scent of old paper. He had been a quiet, gentle man in his later years, but she had seen glimpses of the steel beneath. He had taught her chess, not just as a game, but as a lesson in strategy. "Always see the whole board, Ellie," he used to say, his voice a low rumble. "Don't just look at your next move. Look 3, 4, 5 moves ahead. And never, ever underestimate your opponent. But more importantly, never let them accurately estimate you." He had seen the world in a way she was only just beginning to understand. He had seen the Sterlings of the world for what they were: grasping, hollow men who confused wealth with worth. He had warned her about them. "They'll smile at you, Ellie," he'd said, his eyes sad and wise. "They'll welcome you with open arms, as long as they think you're no threat. The moment they sense you have something they want, or something they can't control, the knives will come out." She had thought he was being cynical. She had thought the world had changed. She had believed in love, in connection, in the fundamental goodness of people. The Sterlings had disabused her of that notion in the space of a single evening. Harold had not just left her his fortune. He had left her his knowledge. He had spent the last 2 years of his life preparing her, though she hadn't realized it at the time. He had walked her through the complex web of trusts and holding companies that constituted Vance Innovations. He had made her read decades of board minutes, financial reports, and legal correspondence. He had told her stories about every person on his board, their strengths, their weaknesses, their loyalties. "You have to know the people, Ellie," he had insisted. "The numbers are just a reflection of their actions. The real story is always in the people." And he had given her the journal, his personal record, his memory. "There are things in here that aren't in any official document," he had told her, his hand frail as he pressed it into hers. "Things people have forgotten, things people hope have been forgotten. Knowledge is power, yes, but memory is a weapon." At the time, she had thought it was a sentimental gift, a way for her to know him better. Now she understood. It was an arsenal. The anger was burning hotter now, burning away the tears, the grief, the self-pity. It was forging something new in their place: resolve, cold, hard, and absolute. The Sterlings had made a critical error. They had mistaken her kindness for weakness. They had mistaken her humility for lack of substance. They had underestimated her. It was an error she was going to make them pay for. Dearly. She stood up, her movements now crisp and purposeful. She walked to her bookshelf, the one Julian had offered to replace with something more modern, and pulled down a row of nondescript binders. To any casual observer, they looked like college notebooks. But inside, they contained the painstakingly organized summary of everything Harold had taught her. The entire corporate structure of Vance Innovations mapped out. The personal histories of every board member, the intricate details of the company's most valuable assets, a portfolio of patents that were the bedrock of the entire mobile communication industry. She remembered a specific conversation with Harold months before he passed. He had been looking out the window, a thoughtful expression on his face. "There's this one patent," he had said almost to himself. "The keystone patent, I call it. Not the most profitable, but the most essential. It governs the core data compression algorithm for 5G networks. We license it out for a pittance as a gesture of goodwill. But if we ever chose to revoke those licenses or enforce the infringement clauses, well, it would be like pulling the keystone from an arch. The whole thing would come tumbling down." He had looked at her then, a sharp, assessing glint in his eye. "A leader needs to know where the keystones are, Ellie, and they need to have the courage to pull them if necessary." She had a sudden, vivid memory of the documents Julian had left on his desk, the ones detailing the Sterling Corp takeover. The target company, Innovatech, was small, but it was a key player in the 5G infrastructure space. Its entire business model was built on a licensing agreement, an agreement with Vance Innovations, an agreement that could be revoked. And then, another piece of the puzzle slotted into place. The name of the law firm on the Sterling prenup: Lockhart, Finch, and Sterling. Arthur's brother was a senior partner. They were an old money firm, known for their aggressive take-no-prisoners approach. Harold had mentioned them in his journal. He had called them vultures in bespoke suits. But more importantly, she remembered something else. A note in the margin of one of Harold's old ledgers. A name. Marcus Thorne. Next to the name, Harold had written, "An honest lawyer, a rare and valuable thing, remembers the Lockhart betrayal." The sun was fully up now, streaming into her apartment. The darkness was gone, both outside and in. Ilara felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. The path ahead was daunting and dangerous. The Sterlings were powerful, connected, and utterly ruthless. They would not go down without a fight. But they had made a mistake. They had started a war with a woman who had just inherited an arsenal she was finally learning how to use. They had pushed her, and they were about to discover what she was made of. It wasn't sugar and spice and everything nice. It was iron and steel and the unyielding memory of a man who had taught her how to fight. She picked up her phone. Her hands were steady now. She scrolled through her contacts, past Julian's name, a name that now seemed alien and toxic, and found the one person she knew she could trust. The one person who would understand the anger and the need for justice. She pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a voice, sharp and alert even at this early hour, answered. "Chloe, it's Ilara. I need your help. I'm burning it all down." Chloe arrived less than an hour later, armed with a large coffee for Ilara and a travel mug of her own that smelled suspiciously of Irish whiskey. She was a whirlwind of energy and righteous indignation, her sharp legal mind already whirring. Chloe had been Ilara's best friend since college, a fierce, loyal, and brutally honest woman who had never liked Julian. She had called him a Ken doll with a credit card, and had warned Ilara that his charm was a little too polished to be real. Ilara had dismissed her concerns as cynicism. Now, Chloe's words felt prophetic. "Okay," Chloe said, pacing the small living room after Ilara had given her the condensed, tear-free version of the previous night's events. "Let's unpack this. They gave you a predatory prenup at a family dinner in front of an audience, and your fiancé sat there and let it happen." "That's the gist of it," Ilara said, sipping the coffee. It was hot and strong, and it felt like a lifeline. And their reason was that you bring nothing to the table," Chloe continued, her voice dripping with scorn. "While being completely unaware that you own the damn table, the chairs, the building the table is in, and the company that manufactured the silverware." "Essentially, yes." Chloe stopped pacing and fixed Ilara with a look of pure, unadulterated glee. "Oh, this is beautiful. This is poetic. This is, get the popcorn and watch the fireworks beautiful. We are going to bury them, Ilara. We are going to take every smug, condescending word they ever said to you and make them choke on it." The fierce loyalty in Chloe's voice was a balm to Ilara's bruised soul. For the first time in 12 hours, she didn't feel completely alone. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "It's all so big. Vance Innovations, the board, the patents. Harold tried to teach me, but I feel like I'm drowning." "You're not drowning," Chloe said firmly. "You're learning to breathe underwater. First things first. We need a proper legal team. I'm a good contract lawyer, but this is big league corporate warfare. You mentioned a name from Harold's journal? Marcus Thorne?" Ilara nodded, her mind already clearer, more focused. "Harold called him an honest lawyer." "An honest lawyer who remembers a betrayal by the Sterling's firm," Chloe said, her eyes lighting up. "That's not just a lawyer, Ilara. That's a motivated ally. We'll find him. Next, the prenup." She scoffed. That piece of garbage. Did you touch it? Did you take it with you? No, Ilara said. I left it on the table, along with Harold's journal. Good. Chloe said. Let them think you're scared and running. Let them think they've won. The most dangerous animal in the jungle isn't the one that roars. It's the one you don't see until it's too late. She pulled out her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Okay, Marcus Thorne. Let's see what we can find. While I'm doing that, you need to do something for me. I need you to write down everything. Every conversation with Julian where he talked about money. Every time he was stressed about work. Every mention of the Innovatech deal. Every red flag you ignored. Why? Ilara asked. Because Julian is their weak point, Chloe explained, not looking up from her screen. The parents are old money sharks. They're careful. But Julian, he's arrogant. He's sloppy. He's been playing the part of the successful heir for so long, he probably thinks it's real. But my guess is, it's not. People who are truly secure in their wealth don't need to humiliate a librarian to feel powerful. The Sterlings are desperate. We just need to find out why. The next few days were a whirlwind of focused activity. Chloe, with her relentless energy, was a force of nature. She tracked down Marcus Thorne, who turned out to be a semi-retired but legendary corporate lawyer living in upstate New York. When Chloe mentioned Harold Vance's name, and the name Sterling, Thorne agreed to a meeting without hesitation. While Chloe handled the legal logistics, Ilara immersed herself in Harold's world. She opened the binders, she spread the documents across her floor, and she began to connect the dots. She read and reread Harold's journals, not just for information, but for his voice, his wisdom. She discovered the depth of the Sterling-Vance rivalry. It went back 2 generations. The Sterlings had built their initial fortune on a technology that Harold's father had invented, but had failed to patent in time. The Sterlings had swooped in, modified it just enough to avoid legal action, and built an empire on what was essentially stolen intellectual property. Harold had never forgiven them. He had spent his life out-innovating them, out-maneuvering them, always staying one step ahead. And now, the Sterlings, their own fortunes apparently dwindling, were trying to get their hands on the crown jewel of his empire through a hostile takeover and through a marriage. They weren't just trying to acquire a company, they were trying to consume the Vance legacy itself. As she dug deeper, a darker picture of Julian began to emerge. Following Chloe's advice, she pieced together fragments of conversations, casual remarks, and unexplained absences. The late nights, he claimed, were work emergencies, the vague, stressed-out phone calls about market fluctuations, the time he'd lost his watch, a ridiculously expensive timepiece her grandfather had given her, and she, in a moment of foolish love, had given to Julian. The pieces started to form a pattern of desperation. Chloe, meanwhile, had hired a private investigator, a discreet, professional woman named Ms. Alvarez, who specialized in financial forensics. No sketchy guys in trench coats, Chloe had said. We need someone who can follow the money, not just the man. The first report from Ms. Alvarez was a bombshell. Julian was not the savvy, successful vice president of Sterling Corp he pretended to be. He held the title, but his role was largely ceremonial. His salary was substantial, but his spending was astronomical. He had massive credit card debt, a string of high-interest personal loans, and, most damningly, a line of credit with a very exclusive, very private online bookmaker based in Macau. He wasn't just in debt, he was drowning in it, and his gambling was escalating. He was making bigger, more desperate bets, trying to win back his losses. The Innovatech deal, Ilara said, her voice a hollow echo in her own apartment. She was looking at a printout of Julian's betting history, He had lost a staggering amount of money betting on a series of obscure foreign soccer matches. It's not just a business deal for him, it's his lifeline. It's his get-out-of-jail-free card, Chloe corrected her. If the deal goes through, Sterling Corp's stock will soar. His own stock options will be worth a fortune. He can pay off his debts and no one will be the wiser. But if it fails, he's ruined, Ilara finished, and he'll take the family down with him. Suddenly, the cruelty of the dinner made a new, more sinister kind of sense. It wasn't just about social snobbery. It was about raw, primal fear. They needed this marriage to go through. They needed to secure her, to bind her to them, because they suspected she had something they needed. They just had no idea how much. They thought they were playing poker with a novice, not realizing she held all the aces. The meeting with Marcus Thorne was the turning point. They met in a quiet, wood-paneled office in a building that bespoke old-world discretion. Thorne was in his late 70s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had a quiet, grandfatherly demeanor, but his questions were as precise as a surgeon's scalpel. Ilara told him everything. She laid out the history, the prenup, the discoveries about Julian's debt, the Innovatech deal, and the Keystone patent. She showed him Harold's journal. Thorne listened patiently, his hands steepled, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then, he picked up the journal and handled it with a reverence that touched Ilara's heart. "Harold Vance was a great man," Thorne said, his voice raspy with emotion. "He was also my friend. I was a junior associate at the firm that represented him when Sterling's father stole his father's work. I saw the injustice firsthand. I've been waiting for this day for 50 years. He looked at Ilara, a fierce light in his eyes. "You are not just Harold's heir, Miss Vance. You are his legacy, and we are not going to let the vultures pick it apart." The plan they formulated was audacious, elegant, and utterly ruthless. It was a strategy worthy of Harold Vance himself. It wasn't just about stopping the takeover. It was about dismantling the entire Sterling empire, piece by piece. Phase 1 was silence. Ilara was to disappear. She would not answer Julian's calls, texts, or emails. She would let his panic grow. Let him believe she had run away, scared, and broken. Phase 2 was preparation. Thorne's team, working with Chloe, would begin preparing the legal groundwork. They would draft the paperwork to call an emergency meeting of the Vance Innovations Board. They would prepare the notices to revoke the licensing agreements for the Keystone patent. And they would prepare a comprehensive dossier on the Sterling's financial situation to be presented to the board and, if necessary, the SEC. Phase 3 was the trap. The Sterlings believed the key to their salvation was the Innovatech deal. They were rushing it through, cutting corners, desperate to close before their financial house of cards collapsed. They had scheduled a press conference and a signing ceremony to announce the deal, a grand public display of their supposed success. "They are building their own guillotine," Thorne had said, a grim smile on his face. "All we have to do is let them place their necks in it." The final piece of the plan was the most difficult for Ilara. It required her to do nothing, to wait, to trust the plan, to let the Sterlings and Julian walk themselves to the edge of the cliff. The week leading up to the announcement was agonizing. Julian's messages went from pleading, "Ilara, where are you? I'm sorry, we can talk about this," to demanding, "I am your fiancé. You will answer me," to threatening, "If you're trying to ruin this for me, you'll regret it." Each message was a fresh stab of pain, a reminder of the man she had loved, but it was also a confirmation. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was sorry he had been caught. He was terrified of the consequences, not for her feelings, but for his own precarious situation. On the day before the scheduled press conference, a courier arrived at her apartment. There was no return address. Inside the envelope was the prenuptial agreement and a single, stark note from Julian. "Tomorrow, I'm announcing the biggest deal of my career. My family will be there. Our partners will be there. The press will be there. You can be there too, by my side, as my future wife. Or you can be nothing. Sign the papers. Be at the Sterling Tower by noon. This is your last chance, Ilara. Don't throw your life away." It was the final provocation, the last act of breathtaking arrogance. He still thought he held all the cards. He was still trying to command her, to threaten her into submission. He was offering her a chance to be a part of his triumph, a pretty accessory on the arm of the great man. He had no idea that the triumph was a sham. He had no idea that the stage he had so carefully set for his own coronation was about to become the site of his execution. Ilara looked at the prenup, at the cold, clinical language that reduced her to a liability. She thought of Beatrice's words. "You bring nothing to this table?" She picked up a pen. Her hand was perfectly steady. She didn't sign the document. Instead, on the back of Julian's arrogant, threatening note, she wrote a single sentence. A message for Marcus Thorne. "The keystone. It's time to pull it." The day of the press conference dawned bright and clear, a perfect autumn day. The kind of day that felt full of promise and possibility. For the Sterlings, it was the day that would mark their triumphant return to the pinnacle of the financial world. For Ilara, it was Judgment Day. She chose her outfit with deliberate care. Not the simple black dress of the disastrous dinner. Not a power suit that would signal her intentions too early. She chose a dress in a soft, dove-gray color. It was elegant, understated, and impeccably tailored. It was a dress that was designed to be overlooked, to allow its wearer to blend into the background. It was the color of smoke, of shadows, of things unseen. She arrived at the Sterling Tower, a gleaming monument of glass and steel that dominated the city skyline, and entered not through the grand main entrance, but through a side door, using a guest pass that Marcus Thorne's office had arranged. She took a service elevator to the 40th floor, where the conference was being held, and found a position at the very back of the room, behind the rows of assembled journalists and television cameras. The room was buzzing with energy. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne. The mood was celebratory, expectant. On the stage at the front of the room, a large banner proclaimed, "Sterling Corp and Innovatec, building the future together." She saw them immediately, the Sterling family holding court in the front row. Arthur, looking expansive and proud, shaking hands with investors. Beatrice, radiant in a Chanel suit, her smile as bright and hard as a diamond. And Julian, he stood slightly apart, scanning the room, a nervous energy radiating from him. He looked handsome, successful, the very picture of a young titan of industry. But Ilara could see the tension in his shoulders, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. He was looking for her. Her heart gave a painful lurch, a ghost of the old affection, the old pity. He was a gambler who had bet everything on one last spin of the wheel, and he had no idea the house was about to change the rules. She pushed the feeling away, replacing it with the cold, hard resolve that had been her constant companion for the past week. He had made his choices. Now, he would live with the consequences. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the room. Arthur Sterling strode to the podium, his face beaming. "Welcome," he began, his voice booming through the speakers. "Welcome, friends, partners, members of the press. Today is a historic day. A day that marks not just a new chapter for Sterling Corp, but a new era for the entire industry. He launched into a grand, self-congratulatory speech about vision, synergy, and the bold future of 5G technology. He spoke of Innovatech as a plucky young company that Sterling Corp was proud to bring into its fold. He was a masterful performer, weaving a narrative of strength and success that was, as Alara knew, a complete fabrication. She watched the faces in the crowd, the investors, the analysts. They were eating it up. They were buying the story. The Sterling name still had power, a residual glow of past glories that could blind people to the decay within. Arthur then introduced the CEO of Innovatech, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, who mumbled a few words about the great honor of joining the Sterling family. It was a pathetic, fawning performance. Alara felt a pang of pity for him. He was just another pawn in the Sterling's desperate game. Finally, Arthur called his son to the stage. "And none of this would have been possible," he said, his voice thick with pride, "without the tireless work of my son, the driving force behind this deal, the future of Sterling Corp, Julian Sterling." Julian walked to the podium amidst a round of enthusiastic applause. He smiled, that perfect, polished smile, but Alara could see the strain. He was so close. He could taste the victory. "Thank you, Father," he said. "Thank you all for being here. This deal is about more than just business. It's about securing our legacy. It's about proving that the Sterling name will continue to be synonymous with excellence and innovation for generations to come." He paused, taking a sip of water. His eyes scanned the room again, a flicker of desperation in them. He was still looking for her, still expecting her to walk through that door, signed prenup in hand, ready to validate his triumph. It was at that moment that Alara began to move. She didn't rush. She walked slowly, deliberately, down the side aisle of the crowded room. She didn't look at the stage. She looked at the faces of the people she passed. The journalists, the investors. She was a ghost, a whisper, moving through their celebration. No one paid her any mind. She was just a woman in a gray dress, a nobody. On stage, Julian was reaching the climax of his speech. "And so, it is with immense pride and a profound sense of destiny that we officially sign the documents that will unite our two great companies." Section he and the Innovatech CEO sat down at a large table where the contracts were laid out. The cameras flashed, a frenzy of photographic evidence of a deal that was already dead. As Julian picked up the pen, a new figure entered the room, not from the back, where Alara had been, but from a side door near the stage. It was Marcus Thorne. He was flanked by two other men in dark suits who had the unmistakable look of seasoned corporate litigators. They moved with a quiet, unhurried purpose that instantly commanded attention. The celebratory buzz in the room faltered. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Who were these men? They were not on the guest list. Thorne walked directly to the stage, ignoring the frantic whispers of the PR handlers trying to intercept him. He stepped onto the stage and approached the podium, which Arthur Sterling had just vacated. Arthur stepped forward, his face a thunderous mask of fury. "Who the devil are you?" he demanded. "This is a private event. Security." "I wouldn't do that, Arthur," Thorne said, his voice calm and clear, amplified by the microphone. It cut through the confused murmur of the room like a scalpel. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am the lead counsel for Vance Innovations." A collective gasp went through the room. Vance Innovations. The sleeping giant. The company whose patents underpinned the very technology they were all here to celebrate. Julian had frozen, the pen hovering over the signature line. His face had gone chalk white. He stared at Thorne as if seeing a ghost. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur blustered, though his voice had lost its confident boom. "Vance Innovations has no standing here. This is a deal between Sterling Corp and Innovatech." "That's where you're mistaken," Thorne said, his voice laced with an icy precision. "You see, Innovatech's entire valuation is based on its licensing agreement for a portfolio of patents held by Vance Innovations. Specifically, patent number 7,345,891. The Keystone patent, as we like to call it." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He scanned the room, his eyes finally landing on Ilara, who was now standing near the front, just to the side of the stage. He gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. "As of 9 a.m. this morning," Thorne announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "Vance Innovations, by a unanimous vote of its board of directors, has revoked all licensing agreements related to that patent, effective immediately." The silence that followed was the most profound, most absolute silence Ilara had ever experienced. It was not an empty silence. It was a silence filled with the deafening sound of $1 billion deal evaporating into thin air. It was the silence of ruin. The Innovatech CEO made a small, choking sound and swayed on his feet. The investors in the front row were staring, their mouths agape, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. The journalists were scribbling furiously, their expressions a mixture of shock and professional glee. They had come for a celebration. They were getting a massacre. "You can't do that!" Julian finally screamed, leaping to his feet. The pen clattered from his nerveless fingers. "That's illegal. We have a contract." "You have a contract with Innovatech," Thorne corrected him smoothly. "A company which, as of this moment, has a net worth of approximately zero. Its only asset has just been rendered worthless. I believe the legal term for what you are about to sign is a very, very bad deal." Arthur Sterling looked as if he had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. His face was gray, his breathing ragged. He leaned on the table for support. "Why?" he whispered, the single word a plea. "Why would you do this?" Thorne didn't answer. Instead, he looked towards the side of the stage. "I believe that question is best answered by our new chairwoman." He gestured towards Ilara, and for the second time in as many minutes, a wave of stunned silence swept the room. This time, it was laced with utter confusion. All eyes turned to the woman in the gray dress, the woman no one had noticed, the woman who was now walking calmly towards the steps of the stage. Julian stared at her, his face a mask of horrified comprehension. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. He finally understood. He had been looking for her in the crowd, expecting her to arrive as a supplicant. He had never imagined she would arrive as the executioner. Beatrice, in the front row, let out a small, strangled cry. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief. Ilara walked up the steps and stood beside Marcus Thorne at the podium. She felt a strange sense of calm. The room, the people, the chaos, it all seemed to fade into the background. There was only her and the task at hand. She looked out at the sea of shocked faces. She found Julian's eyes and held his gaze. She saw the panic, the fear, the dawning, soul-crushing realization of just how badly he had miscalculated. Then her gaze shifted to the front row, to the woman in the Chanel suit who looked as if she was about to faint. Beatrice Sterling, the architect of this moment, the woman who had given her the gift of her own rage. Ilara leaned into the microphone. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud. It was not angry. It was quiet, calm, and devastatingly clear. "You said I bring nothing to the table," she said, her eyes locked on Beatrice's. She paused, letting the words hang in the air, a perfect, brutal echo of that night in the dining room. "It seems," she continued, her voice as soft and sharp as a surgeon's knife, "that I own the table, and everyone sitting at it." The silence that followed this declaration was different. It was the sound of a world being remade, of a power structure being dismantled in real time. Beatrice Sterling made a small, wounded noise and slumped in her chair, her face ashen. Arthur looked as if he had been physically struck, his hand clutching at his chest. Julian was the first to break. His composure, the polished veneer he had spent his life cultivating, shattered into a million pieces. "You!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with a hysterical rage. "You did this! You planned this!" He lunged towards her, his face contorted into a mask of fury. He never made it. The two men who had entered with Marcus Thorne, who had been standing impassively at the side of the stage, moved with a swift, coordinated grace. They intercepted Julian before he had taken 2 steps, each grabbing an arm in a grip that was firm and unyielding. "Let go of me!" he raged, struggling futilely. "She's a liar. A manipulative snake." "I don't think so, Mr. Sterling," said a new voice. A calm, authoritative voice that cut through Julian's panicked shouts. 2 uniformed police officers, accompanied by a man in a detective's suit, were now making their way through the stunned crowd towards the stage. The detective held up a badge and a warrant. "Julian Sterling, you're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement." The second bombshell landed in the silent room with the force of a physical explosion. Embezzlement. Fraud. The whispers started instantly, a wildfire of speculation and scandal spreading through the room. Ms. Alvarez's investigation, it turned out, had uncovered more than just gambling debts. It had uncovered a systematic pattern of Julian siphoning funds from Sterling Corp., using a complex series of offshore accounts and shell companies to cover his losses. He hadn't just been betting his own money, he had been betting the company's. The Innovatech deal wasn't just his lifeline. It was the way he was planning to cover the massive hole he had blown in the Sterling Corp balance sheet. Thorne's team had quietly presented the evidence to the district attorney's office that morning. The warrant had been issued less than an hour ago. Julian's struggles ceased. The fight went out of him, replaced by a slack-jawed horror. He looked from the detectives to Ilara, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. This wasn't just about a broken engagement. This wasn't just about a business deal. This was a complete and total annihilation. As the officers led a now limp Julian away, his hands cuffed behind his back, Arthur Sterling let out a guttural cry and collapsed, clutching his chest. Paramedics, who had been discreetly waiting in the wings at Thorne's request, rushed to his side. The celebratory press conference had officially devolved into a scene of carnage. Ilara stood at the podium, watching the chaos unfold. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching a movie. The shouting journalists, the flashing cameras, the panicked investors all seemed a world away. She had unleashed the storm, and now she was standing in its calm, quiet eye. She looked at the contract on the table, the one Julian had been about to sign. The ink from the pen he had dropped had bled across the page, a black spiderwebbing stain across his name. It was a fitting epitaph for his career. Marcus Thorne stepped up beside her. "The board of Vance Innovations is convening in 1 hour," he said quietly, his voice for her ears only. "They're waiting to meet their new chairwoman." Ilara nodded, her eyes still on the scene below. She saw Beatrice being helped from her chair, her face a crumpled mask of despair. The queen had been deposed. Her kingdom was in ruins. Her son was on his way to jail. Her husband was on his way to the hospital. For a fleeting moment, Ilara felt a flicker of something. Not pity, not anymore, but a profound and weary sadness for the sheer, pointless waste of it all. They had had so much. Wealth, status, a family. And they had thrown it all away, driven by greed, arrogance, and a bottomless insecurity that could only be fed by diminishing others. "Miss Vance," Thorne said, his voice gentle. "It's time to go." She turned her back on the wreckage of the Sterling family. She didn't look back. She walked off the stage, past the gawking crowds and the shouting reporters, and followed Marcus Thorne to a private elevator. As the doors slid shut, sealing her off from the chaos, she caught her reflection in the polished steel. She was still wearing the gray dress, the color of smoke and shadows, but she was no longer invisible. She was the fire. The emergency board meeting of Vance Innovations was held in the same boardroom where Harold had spent the last 40 years of his life building his empire. It was a room that hummed with quiet power, paneled in dark, rich mahogany, and dominated by a massive table that could seat 30. At the head of the table was Harold's chair, a large leather throne that had remained empty since his passing. When Ilara walked in, flanked by Marcus Thorne, the 24 members of the board fell silent. They were a formidable group, titans of industry and finance, men and women who had been loyal to Harold for decades. They had all known her as Harold's girl, the quiet, bookish young woman who had brought a spark of life back into the old man's eyes. Now, they were seeing her for the first time as their leader. She felt a tremor of apprehension. These were people who had forgotten more about business than she had yet learned. But then she met the eyes of the woman sitting to the right of Harold's chair, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Evelyn Reed, who had been Harold's COO and closest confidant. Evelyn gave her a small, encouraging smile. It was a transfer of power, an acceptance. Thorne cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "As stipulated in the final codicil of Harold Vance's last will and testament, upon her 30th birthday or upon a unanimous declaration of the board, full controlling interest of Vance Innovations and the position of chairwoman of the board passes to his granddaughter, Ms. Ilara Vance." He paused. "We have just witnessed the precipitating event that has made this transition necessary. I believe a formal vote is in order." Evelyn Reed stood up. "I think I speak for everyone in this room, Marcus, when I say that no vote is necessary. We have seen what Ms. Vance is capable of. She is her grandfather's granddaughter. Welcome, Madam Chairwoman." A murmur of assent went around the table. One by one, the board members stood, their faces a mixture of respect, admiration, and a healthy dose of awe. They had just witnessed a masterclass in corporate warfare, executed with a precision and ruthlessness that would have made Harold proud. Ilara felt a lump form in her throat. She had come here expecting a fight, a challenge to her authority. Instead, she had found a family bound not by blood, but by loyalty to a shared legacy. She took her place at the head of the table, in her grandfather's chair. It felt right, as if she had finally come home. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Thank you all. I know I have much to learn, and I will be relying on your wisdom and experience. But my grandfather taught me that the first duty of this company is not to profit, but to innovate, to build, and to act with integrity. The Sterling family forgot that. We will not." She then laid out her vision, not one of vengeance, but of renewal, She announced the immediate creation of a $50 million fund to support independent tech startups, particularly those founded by women and minorities. She announced a plan to reevaluate all of their licensing agreements to ensure they were being used not just for profit, but for progress. And she announced that all profits from the now-defunct Innovatech portfolio would be redirected into a new charitable foundation dedicated to promoting STEM education in underserved communities. The Harold Vance Foundation. It was a bold, audacious plan, one that shifted the company's focus from pure profit to purposeful innovation. It was a plan that could have been met with resistance, with skepticism. But the board, energized by the decisiveness of their new leader, embraced it with enthusiasm. They had been adrift since Harold's passing, a ship without a rudder. Now, they had a new captain and a clear direction. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of the Sterling's downfall became public knowledge. Arthur Sterling had suffered a major heart attack. He survived, but he was incapacitated, his career over. Sterling Corp., without its leader and facing a catastrophic loss of investor confidence, went into a death spiral. It was delisted from the stock exchange and eventually carved up and sold for parts by its creditors. The Sterling name, once a symbol of wealth and power, became a byword for fraud and failure. Julian, denied bail, was facing a raft of federal charges that carried a minimum sentence of 20 years. His only hope was to cooperate, to turn on his co-conspirators, but his arrogance had left him with no allies. He was alone, facing the consequences of his own hubris. Beatrice was the one who haunted Ilara's thoughts. Stripped of her wealth, her status, her entire reason for being, she was a ghost rattling around the empty shell of her former life. The mansion was seized by the banks. The jewels were sold to pay legal fees. The fair-weather friends who had once flocked to her parties now crossed the street to avoid her. One afternoon, Marcus Thorne brought Ilara a document to sign. It was a final small piece of the Sterling estate, a modest, managed care annuity. "It's Beatrice's," Thorne explained. "It's all she has left. We could contest it, absorb it into the bankruptcy proceedings. It's pocket change for us, but for her, it's everything." Ilara looked at the document. She thought of Beatrice's cruel, smiling face at that dinner. She thought of the humiliation, the casual cruelty. She could, with a stroke of her pen, condemn the woman to utter destitution. It was what Beatrice deserved. It was what justice demanded. But then she thought of her grandfather. Harold had been ruthless in business, but he had never been cruel. "Vengeance is a poison you drink, hoping the other person will die," he had once told her. "Let her have it," Ilara said, pushing the document back across the table. "My war is with the men who built that empire of lies. She is just a casualty. Let her live out her days in peace." It was an act of mercy, but it was also a final, subtle assertion of power. Beatrice would live on the charity of the woman she had tried to destroy. A humiliation more profound than any poverty. Ilara signed the document not to contest, but to approve the transfer. It was her one small act of compassion in the midst of the wreckage. A quiet detail to prove to herself that she had not become them. The war was over. She had won, and in the quiet aftermath, she made the choice to be a ruler, not a destroyer. It was a lesson the Sterlings had never learned, and the final, most important part of her victory. 1 year later, Ilara stood on a windy bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The air was crisp, scented with salt and sagebrush. Below her, construction was underway on the new campus for the Vance Innovations Research and Development Center. It was a bold, beautiful design, a series of low-slung buildings with living roofs and glass walls that seemed to merge seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. The past year had been a whirlwind. Taking the helm of a multi-billion-dollar corporation had been like drinking from a fire hose. There were days she felt overwhelmed, an imposter in her grandfather's chair. But with the support of Evelyn Reed, Marcus Thorne, and the rest of the board, she had grown into the role. She had proven to be a natural leader, with her grandfather's strategic mind and a deep, empathetic understanding of the people who made the company run. She had streamlined the bureaucracy, fostered a culture of creativity and collaboration, and launched a series of initiatives that had not only boosted profits, but had also re-established Vance Innovations as a leader in ethical technology. The Harold Vance Foundation was already funding scholarships for hundreds of young students, and the startup fund had seeded a dozen promising new companies. She was no longer Harold's granddaughter. She was Elara Vance, the visionary CEO who was reshaping the tech world. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path behind her made her turn. A man was approaching, carrying 2 steaming mugs and a roll of blueprints under his arm. It was Leo, the architect of the new campus. They had met 6 months ago over a series of contentious meetings about the building's design. He had been passionate, brilliant, and utterly unimpressed by her title. He had argued with her, challenged her, and pushed her to be bolder in her vision. She had found it infuriating and exhilarating. He was kind and funny, and he had a warmth and an integrity that she had thought no longer existed in the world. He was successful in his own right, a rising star in the world of architecture, and he treated her not as a CEO or a wealthy heiress, but as a partner, an equal. He knew about her past, about the Sterlings, about the public drama. He had read the news articles, but he was more interested in her ideas about quantum computing and her terrible taste in cheesy sci-fi movies. "Brought you coffee," he said, handing her a mug, "and the revised plans for the solar array. I think you'll be pleased. We've managed to increase the efficiency by another 12%. "Leo, you're a genius," she said, taking the mug. The warmth spread through her hands, a simple, comforting pleasure. He unrolled the blueprints on a nearby retaining wall, and they bent over them together, their heads close. He smelled of coffee and fresh air. He pointed out the changes, his voice full of passion and excitement for his work. She listened, interjecting with questions, her mind sharp and engaged. It was in moments like these that she felt the full measure of her new life. A life of purpose, of passion, of genuine connection. A life she had built for herself, on her own terms. Occasionally, she would receive updates on the Sterlings, filtered through Marcus Thorne's office. Julian had been sentenced to 15 years in a federal prison. His appeals had been exhausted. He was a forgotten man, a ghost in the system. His father, Arthur, had passed away a few months after the sentencing, his death certificate listing a massive coronary, but Thorne had called it a broken heart, or perhaps a broken ego. And Beatrice? Beatrice was living in a small, respectable retirement community in Florida, under a different name. She lived on the annuity that Elara had approved. She played bridge and tended a small garden. No one there knew who she had been. She was just another lonely old woman with a past she never spoke of. Her punishment was not poverty, but irrelevance. To be stripped of the name and the status that had been her entire identity was a fate worse than death. Elara felt nothing when she heard this news. No triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet, distant sadness. They were figures from a different lifetime, a different story, a story that had ended a long, long time ago. Leo was explaining how the new design would not only make the campus energy neutral, but would actually feed power back into the local grid. "It's not just a building," he said, his eyes shining. "It's a statement about the kind of future we want to build." Ilara looked at him, at his earnest, hopeful face, and she felt a wave of gratitude so profound it almost brought her to tears. She had survived the fire. She had walked through the wreckage, and she had found this. A new beginning. A better future. She thought back to that night, to the girl in the cheap black dress, feeling small and worthless under the scornful gaze of the Sterling family. What would she say to that girl now? She would tell her that her worth was not determined by the label on her dress or the balance in her bank account. She would tell her that her strength was not in her inheritance, but in her character, in her resilience, in her refusal to be broken. She would tell her that the people who try to make you feel small are always the smallest people of all. "What are you smiling about?" Leo asked, noticing the look on her face. "Just thinking," she said, linking her arm through his, "about how some tables are made to be turned." She had learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of all. You don't need to shout your worth to a world that refuses to listen. You don't need to fight for a seat at a table where you are not welcome. True power lies in knowing that you have the ability to build a better table, one where everyone is valued, and then invite the world to join you. She looked out at the ocean, at the endless horizon, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt completely, utterly free. She was living the life she truly deserved. A life built not on the legacy of her grandfather, but on the strength of her own name. The name they had once laughed at, and now would never forget. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The construction site below fell quiet as the last of the workers packed up for the day. A profound sense of peace settled over Ilara, a feeling she had once thought was unattainable. It was the peace that comes not from the absence of conflict, but from the quiet confidence of having overcome it. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Leo said softly, following her gaze. "The way the light hits the water. It's different every single day." "It is," she agreed. "I used to think I preferred the city, the noise, the energy, but this silence is different. It's full of potential." They stood there for a long time, in comfortable silence, watching the day come to a close. It was a silence that was the polar opposite of the one in the Sterling dining room. That silence had been a weapon, a void used to intimidate and diminish. This silence was a sanctuary, a space for shared thoughts and quiet connection. The journey of the past year had been about more than just revenge or corporate maneuvering. It had been a journey of self-discovery. She had been forced to confront her own naivete, her own willingness to be loved by a man who was incapable of it. She had learned that trusting someone is not the same as abdicating responsibility for your own well-being. Chloe had called it her Phoenix moment, and in many ways, she was right. The old Ilara, the timid, people-pleasing archivist, had burned away in the fire of the Sterling's cruelty. But what had risen from the ashes was not a creature of vengeance. It was a woman who was fully, unapologetically herself. Her work at Vance Innovations was a testament to this transformation. She had taken Harold's legacy and infused it with her own values. The company was more profitable than ever, but it was also more humane. She had instituted paid parental leave, a 4-day work week for the research teams, and a profit-sharing program that extended to every employee, from the janitorial staff to the senior executives. She was proving, on a grand scale, that you could be successful without sacrificing your soul. The media had been fascinated by her story, casting her as a corporate Boudica, a warrior queen who had vanquished her enemies. But they missed the point. Her victory had not been on the battlefield of the press conference. It had been in the quiet moments that followed. The decision to fund a young woman's robotics startup, the choice to let Beatrice Sterling keep her dignity, the quiet evenings spent with Chloe, laughing over a bottle of cheap wine, just like they used to. The real victory was not in their downfall, but in her ascent, not just to power, but to a life of authentic joy and purpose. "I have something for you," Leo said, breaking the silence. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small flat box. Ilara's heart did a little flutter. "Leo, you don't have to—" "I know," he said, his smile warm and genuine. "But I wanted to. It's not, you know." He gestured vaguely, a silent reference to the world of extravagant gifts she now inhabited. "It's just something I made." She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a simple silver pendant. It was a perfect, miniature representation of the new campus, the elegant curves of the buildings and the intricate patterns of the solar arrays rendered in stunning detail. "It's the keystone," she whispered, her fingers tracing the delicate lines. "The central building, the heart of the campus." "I heard the story," he said quietly, "about what you did, about the patent. I thought it was fitting. A reminder that sometimes the most important piece is the one that holds everything else together." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of a kind she hadn't shed in a very long time. Not tears of grief or anger, but tears of overwhelming gratitude. He saw her, not as a symbol, not as a story, but as a person. He understood the meaning behind the actions. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He held her close. "I'm glad you like it," he murmured into her hair. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." In that moment, standing on the edge of the continent, with the future she was building spread out before her, and a man who loved her for who she truly was by her side, Ilara Vance finally understood the true nature of wealth. It wasn't in the bank accounts or the stock portfolios. It wasn't in the power or the prestige. It was in the quiet moments of connection. It was in the shared dreams and the simple, profound joy of being seen and loved and understood. It was a treasure the Sterlings, for all their billions, had never possessed and never could. And it was a fortune she would never, ever lose. The final moral of her story was not about revenge. It was permission. Permission to leave the tables where you are not valued. Permission to trust the quiet knowledge you hold inside. Permission to stop accepting disrespect as a substitute for love. And the permission, above all, to build your own damn table and to choose, with care and with joy, who gets a seat.